Welcome to the webinar TickIT Overcoming the Obstacles. My name is Naveen Harone. I am a marketing executive here at DNV Business Assurance, and I'll be your host this morning. The agenda today is pretty straightforward. We try to keep it as concise as possible. So, in just a few moments, your presenter, Paul Breslin, will be commencing with the main topic, which is overcoming the obstacles in the whole journey of transitioning to TickIT+. He will go into a bit more depth about what the webinar is about. I'll leave technicalities up to the expert himself. At 11:15 there will be a Q&A where we will be happy to answer all your questions, and at 11:30 we will close, so you'll still have the entire day to get on with work. So, what makes this webinar different? Well, some of you may have attended our earlier webinars already, the ones on the essentials of TickIT+. So this follows on as a logical next step from the essentials of TickIT+ from that series. It also updates you on important new developments in schemes. It could be that a couple of months ago, not all the developments and facts were known yet, but of course this is why we have Paul. It will also recap any key steps and deadlines to implement TickIT+. So it's very important for you, of course, to know all the deadlines to make sure you are prepared. And then finally, and more, I guess most importantly, the webinar focuses on the organizational and technical obstacles that can typically slow down your progress. So these are things that we want to make sure that you are prepared for. Then Q&A. So this is probably the most dynamic part of the webinar and the whole reason we host these live webinars. In the Q&A session, the way you do this, you can ask questions by typing in the questions area of the panel on your screens. Okay, so if anybody, we've just had a note from somebody that we should speak up. So in case the audio isn't very clear, please do type a question in the questions area that you see on your screens. Your microphone has been muted, and that is simply to make sure that we have good audio quality for all of you. But again, once the webinar is over, your questions don't need to stop, so please make sure you have, you come to Paul or myself with any questions, and we'll make sure to get back to you. So just a reminder again, please ask questions throughout the presentation by entering in the area on your screen, the questions panel. Technical issues. Should you have any trouble hearing, there are a few things you can do. You can either dial in on the telephone number and access code sent to you on the registration email, which would have come from gotowebinar@citrixonline.com. Audio issues can be somewhat common depending on your whether it's your laptop or your PC. The easiest thing to do is to go into your audio settings, and that's where you can adjust either your microphone or your speakers, as you see on the screen now. Microphone setup, speaker setup. So just play around with that, and you should be okay. One hopes. So back to the presenter. Some of you may already be familiar with Paul. He is, of course, DNV's ICT sector leader. He's also a member of the JTISC, which is the Joint Ticket Industry Steering Committee, and co-developer of the TickIT+ scheme. So he really is in a really good position to tell you all there is to know about the standard and transitioning, because he has seen it from beginning to end. And of course it helps that he has over 20 years of experience in ICT systems development and assessment roles. So without further ado, over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Naveen, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this, which is the latest in our series of web events about TickIT+. Now our focus today, as Naveen said, is on overcoming obstacles. It's primarily about how to deal with the pitfalls that you're likely to come across and the objections on the way to implementing TickIT+ in your organization. However, as a bit of background to that, I will cover a short resume about TickIT Plus in terms of its background and positioning. Now, apologies to some of our regulars who have attended the previous web events, but there are some first-time attendees who may not have seen the Essentials presentations. I think it's always useful to just show where TickIT Plus came from and what its objectives are about. We will look at where the scheme is just now and what's upcoming, more importantly, what the forward work plan looks like, just to give you some idea of what's in store for TickIT Plus. But I will focus on 4 typical obstacles to progress, the sort of things which you'll need to handle and work around or circumvent as you take up TickIT Plus and implement it in your organisation. And just to reiterate, there will be time at the end for questions and answers. What I would say is please register your questions as they occur using the wonders of GoToWebinar's technology, the little input box. Really, the more value we get from these events, the better, and that value is really driven by making sure everybody understands what TickIT Plus is about, and any clarifications they have or uncertainties can be answered. And honestly, no question is too simple or too obvious, because there are some novel features to TickIT Plus, and what might be obvious to some of our delegates would be quite mysterious to others. So really do make full use as you can of the questions and answer session. Okay, good. Well, let's push on and talk about where TickIT Plus came from. Okay, well, its background is that it was launched. TickIT, the original scheme, was launched in 1992. This was on the back of the so-called software crisis and a lot of concerns, primarily in the UK, because it was a branch of UK government that supported the initial TickIT scheme. Concerns about the supply of dependable software and IT systems. Now, the research project led to some recommendations to establish what is best known as a sector-specific scheme for quality management. This is quite a common model in management systems certification against the widely used ISO 9001 standard. And we have other sector schemes that have also got a long history. That's for the automotive sector, in aerospace. Some of you may know of the TL 9000 scheme for telecoms, for example. So TickIT was in good ground, in good company there. It was self-confessed using existing arrangements for quality system auditing. And what it did is define best practice for software and systems development in the IT sector. It's also one of the scheme, which is another feature of the sector schemes, defines some special requirements to formally qualify the auditors. And that's the well-known TickIT auditor that some of you may be familiar with TickIT certifications. Now, the TickIT scheme has been subject to a number of changes over the years since 1992, and it's currently at revision 5.5. Nevertheless, it was not perceived as keeping pace with the rapid rate of change in the ICT sector. There's certain modern themes which the steering committee felt needed to be picked up on. The impact of the software as a service, and the most of the life cycle of the software system being in its in-use phase and being delivered as a service to consumers. A modern development is the advent of the cloud, which as old sweats can be seen as really a modern slant on hosting. But obviously that's having quite a significant impact in models of delivery. Modern life cycles such as agile and rapid development needed to be more carefully picked up on. And finally, the fact that a lot of the challenges are not just to do with quality of delivery, but also in maintaining other characteristics of software and IT systems, such as security, needed to be recognised, and the current threats from security threats from cyberspace had to be taken into account. So what this led to was a design brief for TickIT Plus. A new approach was needed. We needed to broaden the appeal of TickIT. We needed a framework which would allow for integrated assessments to take those different perspectives into account. And also, we needed some mechanism to regain that customer confidence that the assessment protocols that we're using are modern and relevant to the challenges facing organisations, so we could revitalise the scheme. It led to some specific characteristics for the new scheme, TickIT Plus, and that was to take into account multiple international standards that were relevant. And I'll list the 3 standards there, with 9001 for quality being at the heart of the scheme. The key aspect was to make these as requirements that are applicable to the certification, not just guidance. And those of you familiar with TickIT will know that actually the whole of the TickIT scheme was really built around recommendations rather than formal requirements. Now, another key requirement placed on TickIT Plus was to add process capability and the accompanying organisational maturity rating. That is, to make it a graded certification scheme rather than a simple yes-no decision as we have with 9001 certification. Why was that? Well, it would allow for greater differentiation between organisations, the ability to look externally in terms of benchmarking across peers who have also adopted the certification, as well as internally to look at how well your processes are working within the organisation. I've mentioned the international standards, but maintaining that link with accredited certification was felt to be very important, together with actually picking up the baton that's in all of those standards about ongoing improvement. The continual improvement imperative, as realised in the classic plan, do, check, act cycle, is at the heart of these modern management system standards, was felt to be very important and should be particularly emphasised within TickIT Plus. So that gave us some key characteristics for a replacement scheme, but we didn't forget that a lot of organisations had made a significant investment in terms of supporting and implementing TickIT. So we have designed a transition route which would recognise that investment, make it straightforward for TickIT organisations particularly to transfer across to the new scheme. Okay, so what did that mean in practice? Well, rather than go into details about the design of the scheme, I'll cover that as part of explaining the obstacles. I just wanted to highlight a few things here. And one of them is we've captured the new scheme TickIT Plus in a series of documents. Those below the line in blue are the publicly available documents. I really show the green box as the documentation, the design documentation that was used to help define and implement TickIT Plus at the committee level. As Naveen mentioned, JTISC is an acronym which the ICT sector is fond of acronyms, Joint TickIT Industry Steering Committee. That carried through and acted as the continuity point from TickIT to TickIT Plus. It was the JTISC committee using the standards committees methods that was instrumental in designing and implementing TickIT Plus. Now what we have is a series of public documents, and 2 of them I'll touch on as background to the scheme rules and the base process library. But rather than one guidance handbook, there's a series of publications, some for purchase, some for free download, which explain the scheme in terms of guidance as well as give formal requirements. And that's quite important. There's two categories of documents. Those which are the formal descriptions of what you have to do. Secondly, the guidance material. Like we've found with users of TickIT Plus, they do provide useful extra detail on what the motivation and meaning is behind each of the formal requirements. And it helps you interpret the rules more clearly. Okay. So let's just have a look about what this, how these documents describe things. Well, one core aspect of the scheme is the base process library. And this is a direct response to that requirement to have formal process requirements to drive certification. As you would like those who know about assessments and formal certification schemes, this is effectively the assessment criteria. They're captured in the form of a process model. 40 processes in 6 categories, and as you can see there, they cover the full range of IT sector activities. Now it's issued and maintained by the scheme, so the process model is something that will be governed by the TickIT Plus committee. And although it covers the full range of IT sector activities and speaks in ICT vocabulary terms, those of you familiar with the ICT terms such as verification, requirements analysis, you can see that this makes sense to an IT organisation. The detail of the document directly couples the processes to the ISO standards. And that's the key link. Although you are there, the processes define what needs to be implemented by an organisation, there's detailed traceability to the ISO standards that are behind the scheme. Well, that's the assessment criteria. What about the alternative view, the other view of capability, process capability and organisational maturity? Well, that's where we have another standard, ISO 15504, which is a well-established, it's a long-term standard, first issued in 2003, that provides a widely used framework that helps you to talk about process capability. And here it is in the classic TickIT Plus pyramid of 5 levels of process capability. With improving capabilities, you move up the levels. Level 1 is a basic performed process, all the way through an organisationally established process, up to the dizzy heights of an optimising, a closed loop improvement feedback mechanism to help optimise the process implementation. Now this measurement framework is defined in the standard, and that's been captured into the scheme rules, and it's been mapped to an organisational maturity scale, which you can see there, the foundation, bronze, silver, gold and platinum levels, which are the grades of TickIT certification for the organisation. And those are the 3 key elements linking the TickIT Plus scheme. The base processes, as the overall requirements you've got to meet. We can then talk about process capability for the individual processes on a scale of 1 to 5, and then depending on the outcome, you will get a organisational maturity certification at one of the TickIT Plus grades. Well, that's in a nutshell. The rules on how to perform an assessment are in the core scheme requirements, and that explains how to use those base processes and the measurement scale. Let's have a quick look at the timeline. Where did we start? Well, it was early in 2011. I just wanted to highlight some key points on this slide because a number of you will have seen it before, when the training and the certification was available. But it was towards the end of 2011 when we had a baseline release of the library and the key documents to define the scheme, and this allowed the what we call the sunset period for TickIT, the sunset clock, to be started. So there's a formal launch at the beginning of December 11 and the start of the transition period. Let me just jump ahead, as I want to reinforce this date several times. 30th of November 2014 will be the last day of the TickIT scheme. That's when TickIT certifications will become invalid and will need to be withdrawn. Between December 11 and the end of November 14, there will be developments in the TickIT Plus scheme. Some have already happened, such as the extension to cover ISO 20000, and we've got further extensions of the scheme to cover other standards, as well as add on the extra capability levels. And that's what I'm trying to show on this slide. There's quite a bit of detail in here. I just need to highlight that what we're doing is incremental additions so that the TickIT Plus scheme reaches a good solid baseline to help clients go forwards from their TickIT certification. The release back in April 12, the base process library was actually put into a CD format in actually using an editable form rather than PDF. So that makes it for much easier use by the users. I would definitely recommend you look at the use of the CD format so you can make full use of the process library collateral. Also mapped in the ISO 20001 standard for IT service management. Why is that important? Or why was that important? Well, it means that we could start to tackle that integrated assessment imperative from the design brief. And actually at this point in time, both ISO 9001 certification as the core certification standard behind the scheme, integrated assessments against that, and ISO 20000 are now available using the same process library. See, that concept is being taken forwards. Actually, I was hoping it would have been done by now, but it's going to be sometime in September. We've got another release of the base process library, and that will roll in the popular information security standard, ISO 27001. So that will allow triple standard integrated assessments for organisations who want to show that they're conformant with those three standards. There are also some other incremental additions to the scheme documentation, and I'll cover some of the meaning of this later. But what we should have then is a stable baseline to take us through to the critical endpoint of this scheme. The critical endpoint, which is when the TickIT scheme will be withdrawn. I'm going to keep reinforcing this for one very simple reason. This sounds a long distance away. It's not. When you're talking about 6 or 12 monthly audit visits, there is not too many opportunities to take the transition from TickIT to TickIT Plus. We really need to get organisations to be thinking about when they'll transition and how, in terms of exactly what elements of TickIT Plus they'll be using. There is actually a future work programme will continue, and I'll touch on the question we've just been asked in detail towards the end, but just to say, actually, we do note that there's the new structure to ISO standards that's being implemented, the so-called Annex SL, where these management system standards are being normalized to a 10-clause structure. We are going to be mapping to those in future releases of the scheme. We'll also, something that's quite important to understand, is at the moment TickIT Plus is available at foundation grade. That's quite considered. That's to ensure that there's a clear mechanism for organisations to move across straightforwardly to the base level of TickIT Plus. And adding in the higher levels of capability for the organisation, such as bronze and silver, will be done in the next release after the one that's imminent. And we'll be trying to encompass other standards that are relevant to the ICT sphere, and the business continuity standard is quite a good exemplar of that. Okay, so That's a little bit of background on TickIT Plus, and I hope that's not too much for those who have seen this before, but certainly gives a bit of grounding for new delegates who are not familiar with TickIT Plus. I would say actually that the Essentials presentation is available online, so if you do want a bit more information about the drivers behind TickIT Plus, you can always download and use the Essentials, download and read the Essentials presentation. Okay, let's look at obstacle number 1. What's the business case? Now, putting these in a common format about perception and reality as I see it, because perception is, we're not really too sure if we can justify this new approach. What business benefits does TickIT Plus bring? Why should we embrace this new approach? Well, to me, this is really an obstacle about barriers to change. What is there in an organisation that stops you from taking a considered approach to change? Well, the problem is, there's what are you familiar and comfortable with, and management in an organisation that can be comfortable with something they know and recognise. And your classic ISO 9001 audit, it is familiar to themselves and the organisation. It's unobtrusive, depending on the quality of your certification body. Somebody rolls in once a year, has a little poke around and disappears. And that's what I found, unfortunately, is a bit all too common, even in this modern age, and use of ISO 9001 audits for business improvement. The problem is most organisations, they are facing increased demands from their own customers, from prospective new customers, for improved performance and more stringent demands on compliance to multiple standards, protocols, regulations or requirements. And that I can only see is going to increase in the future as procurement organisations, procuring organisations, look to get more and more value from their suppliers. So what's the reality behind all of this? Well, TickIT Plus does deliver benefits on 2 counts, what I call the qualitative and the quantitative. And that's for the organisational excellence, how to show that you are abreast of these increased demands, and also quantitatively, in that it can actually improve your business performance, which is really built around how you look at making business cases and how you credit your integrated processes and management system in terms of its value. So let's look at the organisational excellence benefits. Well, the strapline behind the scheme is from conformance to performance. And what that means is TickIT Plus has really got an eye on the future in terms of saying, look, you're adopting this process model, not to just say we conform to it, but because we're interested in what it can do in terms of our business performance. So, TickIT Plus specifically acts as a driver for continual improvement. And that's built into the scheme in 2 ways, one of which in the scheme rules, as requiring the assessment to take account of what the improvement goals are for the organisation. And secondly, in terms of its process model and the capability scale that's used, that is specifically intended to drive improvement of your business process performance. And so we'll see that improvement is really geared to that organisational excellence aspect of the benefits. Now the scheme design, the design of the processes specifically links your IT processes to business goals. One of the processes about the management framework and the corporate strategy deals with that. And it's specifically there to make clear that actually the TickIT Plus processes are not there as a means to an end, but they're there to support what the business wants to achieve. Because of the formal process model, the scheme will help you embed good process practices, and also it offers clear indication of your capability and organisational maturity through the scale that I've mentioned. There's more involvement in assessments by the organisational staff. Why is that a benefit? Well, actually, it leverages one of the key sources of knowledge about how well your processes are performing, and that's your own people. There's very much an us and them in the management system certification world traditionally. Some modern certification bodies have tried to break down that barrier. TickIT Plus goes a step further by actually having mechanisms to get the organisation's staff involved in the assessments directly. Well, this also helps because there's less disruption, especially if there's multiple standards involved. As I mentioned earlier, there's two ISO standards already included in the scheme. Plans to include another one and then move to further ISO standards means that you can get multiple standards included through an integrated assessment, through one assessment. And that helps when you're looking at multiple dimensions as well as trying to take on capability maturity. So that's the qualitative aspect of the benefits. What about the quantitative aspects? Well, this is very tricky because every organisation I've ever audited has always had a completely different approach to making business cases. So it's very difficult to provide a generic, oh, this is how you do it. What I have done here, and this is carried through from my essentials presentation, is giving you 3 areas where you can think about the value that you're getting from your processes. The first one is sales. So if you want to make a business case for TickIT Plus, get some credit for new sales. Why? Well, that's the middle column. You'll be differentiated from your competition. Your business excellence status will be recognised and your delivery will become more predictable. So what you should do is get a percentage of your new business sales credited to your TickIT Plus program. Now, for those of you busy getting your calculator out, I don't think you can quickly realise that the percentage of your business sales for a large organisation, it only has to be quite a small percentage before really you're starting to cover the costs of incremental changes to your processes and taking on a new assessment approach. Well, take that schema of the benefits area, why you'll get the benefit and exactly how you'll get it, and apply it in other areas, such as reduced operating costs. Most organisations have targets to reduce operating costs. Well, if I was the quality system manager, I'd grab a percentage of that reduction and to say it was specifically due to improvements we made in our processes, taking on the TickIT Plus design to our processes. And a bit more off the wall is the company value, the book value of the company. I've take credit there to a blog that I read about selling a company, and it was really driven around the security controls, and in fact the company's book value was felt to be a lot higher than it would have been because of the ability to talk about key security controls that are being formally managed. Well, that aspect could be broadened to the wider controls and risk management that the TickIT processes would give you. And so grab a percentage of the company's book value and say without the TickIT Plus processes, that percentage would be non-existent or lower. Now those are quite big numbers, the benefits area, sales, costs and company value. You only need small percentages, and to be able to argue small percentages before you've built quite a lot of credit on the positive side of adopting TickIT Plus. So I'll leave that thought with you. There are 2 aspects to tackle the obstacle of making the benefits case. Okay, Now let's have a look at obstacle 2. The scheme is complex. It looks complicated. I don't understand the new approach. Well, really again, this is another obstacle about coping with change and meeting the unexpected and the unfamiliar. The whole of the industry is familiar with the management systems audit and the yes-no outcome. And the key issue here is how to build an understanding of the elements of a TickIT Plus process assessment. What's the reality? TickIT Plus is actually based on well-established methods and approaches for process capability assessment and linking that to business process performance. As I've mentioned, the underpinning standard, ISO 15504, has been around a number of years, first issued in 2003 actually, so there's a lot of experience built up on using that standard. If you want to try and demystify TickIT Plus, I've tried to put it on a page. Again, I've carried through this slide from a previous presentation. If you wanted to try and explain TickIT Plus in a straightforward way, I would start with a pyramid. Explain that it's built around a process model that is formally based on best practice standards, but it provides graded certification so you can measure your increasing capability. It's integrated with 9001, that's the core standard. It comes with a 9001 core to TickIT Plus, but you can extend it into other areas of interest of the organisation. They are optional, it's not a requirement, but they're available, so you can embrace a number of perspectives such as service management and security. But most importantly, it pushes improvement planning as a requirement at all levels that you need to have a think about how you're improving the performance of your processes. Red box about foundation. If you want to take some of the complexity out of TickIT Plus, focus on foundation level. That's what's available now. That's what's going to be the core starting point for organisations in industry. I'll try and demystify the process library, and that's done actually because it comes with a territory. There's a lot of detail. The IT sector is large and complex. TickIT Plus gives you a vehicle to talk about that complexity, and it's self-consciously designed that each process has a common structure. That's what I'm showing here. So once you've understood the structure of a process in general, you can quickly orient yourself as to the meaning of each particular process area when it's talking about its topic. This example here is to do with risk management, and you can see that each process has an identifier and a name, an overall purpose which gives the mission for the process, what it's meant to be achieving, and some outcomes on the left hand side. What are the key externally visible results of following that process? And those three things, the name, purpose and outcome, are the fundamental bones of a TickIT Plus process. The detail is in the base practices and the work products, and these are again simply part of classic process definition. What are the activities? What are the tangible outputs that are produced by a process? What's needed to make it work? Most process model definitions cover these topics quite easily, and these are the things that are needed to show that the process is working. Each of the TickIT Plus processes is described in this way. That will make it easier to understand and to navigate your way around the TickIT Plus processes. Now there's 40 TickIT Plus processes. Sounds a lot, but it's not actually. There's other process models that deal with a single topic like project management. And the ISO standard for that, it has 40 processes just to talk about how to manage a project. Well, TickIT Plus has managed to capture the entire IT sector in 40 processes, but it gives you another mechanism to actually make more sense of that set of processes, and that's called scope profiles. Now these are high-level groupings or categories of processes which relate to a specific business function. There's 8 of them defined for the IT sector within TickIT Plus. They're listed here. And as you look through, you can think about which ones are the sorts of services delivered by your organisation. What I wanted to highlight is they're nearly all in place. At this point in time, the ones in red are defined and designed in the base process library, and the remaining 2 are going to be added in the next release. What I have highlighted in bold are 2 scope profiles which I see as the core ones for most organisations. Certainly on the inquiries we've had and the early adopters, they seem to be the ones that are most relevant to the organisations. What is a scope profile? Well, what this does, it maps in to your organisation only the generic processes that you actually need. Now, that's quite important. You do not need to implement all 40 TickIT Plus processes necessarily. The scope profiles are used to define only those which are relevant to your activities. That can be considerably less. For one of the systems and software development profile, it's only 22 of the TickIT Plus processes. So it makes it a lot more manageable. Another thing that helps make TickIT Plus more understandable and manageable is that the processes remain the same. And that's different to other models where your maturity scale requires you to take on new and different processes. TickIT Plus makes it more straightforward. The basic definition of a process and your implementation stays the same, but what you do is you improve their capability over time. So you implement them at foundation level, and then as you move into further grades of the scheme, the processes stay the same, but you improve the capability and performance of the individual processes using a common measurement framework. And that's quite important. So if you imagine the process dimension, that stays the same for the organisation. As you move up TickIT Plus grades, you move up the y-axis, the capability dimension. And if I wanted to try and say something now that will say, look, don't worry too much about the rest of the pyramid, focus on foundation level, because foundation level only needs level 1 processes. And what that means is you have to show your processes achieve their purposes. That's through a simple measurement attribute, which the TickIT Plus assessor is responsible for reviewing and confirming that it's met, is that the purpose is achieved. Okay, so that's the bones of TickIT Plus in terms of the elements of it to try and demystify the complexity. What you can also do, there's a lot of training and awareness that's available. There's a formal 2-day training course. It is designed for TickIT Plus Foundation assessors, but is also very, very useful for anyone who wants to get familiar with the structure of the scheme and the concepts behind it and what it can mean in practice. It's actually not mandatory for an organisation to have anyone trained on this accredited course, but I certainly would recommend it if that's possible. There's a number of accredited training organisations. Our partner, Develop Capability, who we co-designed these webinars with, provide accredited training. But there is a lot of other assistance out there. These web events, other seminars and workshops that DNV Business Assurance will offer, and other TickIT Plus participants actually. Our next event is on the 16th of October here in London, and that's a more active workshop. You can go onto the TickIT Plus website to get notification of events and activities. And for example, the next scheme-wide public seminar is on the 1st of October in Milton Keynes. So there is assistance out there, and I would encourage everyone to make full use of what support there is in the cyberspace to understand TickIT Plus. Organisations can engage external help through consultants, and there is a training body, registration body behind the scheme called GASQ, who register TickIT Plus assessors and practitioners. Although it's not a formal requirement to be registered with those to offer your services as a consultant, I do recommend that to any organisation is to ask the consultant about their credentials with formal training in the scheme. So, if you want to understand and demystify TickIT Plus, training and awareness is important. Two other things to mention. The documents, there's only really two that are needed. The core scheme requirements and the base process library. They're a must if you want to understand the scheme. They're fairly dry because they're written in the rules and requirements format. And some of the guidance materials, such as the Kickstart guide, the base process library guidance, can be useful explanations behind the concepts in TickIT Plus. Okay. Finally, to try and reassure your management that it's not actually all that complex, it still results in a certificate, much as you have at the moment. You have a 9001 certification, you have the same scope of activities for your IT activities within the organisation. And what you'll be seeing is the TickIT Plus endorsement and the grade on the certification. So here an example for the ACME, for the Not a Company PLC, showing you how a typical certificate might look for an organisation that's embraced TickIT Plus. And the concept here is that we're using some of the framework of management system certification as well as developing it further into the capability sphere. Okay, that was obstacle 2. Let's try and deal with the $1 million question. How much will it cost? Now, hang on a moment, we're talking about management systems. Let's deal with the $1,000 question. How much will it cost? Now, the perception is, well, all of this sounds expensive. Well, fine. To me, this is an obstacle really about how well you understand your own business goals. What is the company vision and policy? What does that actually mean in terms of support for investment in excellence and improvement? Okay? That will help you understand what support you need for the costs of TickIT Plus. See, the reality is TickIT Plus, it's a graded scheme. So it really is completely up to an organisation to choose their target grade. There's no compulsion for an organisation to move up the grades. You don't have to move up to the top of the pyramid in a certain period of time. That's very, very important because it's down to organisations to choose a capability that's appropriate to them. What we're finding is at foundation level, as an assessment, it's pitched at a similar level of investment to a simple 9001 audit. Particularly with transitions for TickIT clients, the way that the assessments are planned and performed do have a very similar feel to a 9001 audit. But another reality is that the incremental cost of adding further standards is reduced over what it would have been, because we're using the TickIT Plus process model as the lens to understand the different perspectives. You have a single lens that will enable you to cover 2, 3 or even more ISO standards. Well, I did mention at the beginning that I'd cover a bit about the implementation plan, and here is a summary of the sort of steps you will need to be taking to implement TickIT Plus. And I've indicated where there might be some external costs, but those of you reading this quickly can see that actually a lot of what you need to do is the internal effort and costs internally to an organisation. Certainly obtaining the documentation that I've mentioned is a key first step. You're not going to get very far with implementing TickIT Plus unless you've got the rules and processes. So obviously they need to be obtained. The core documents have to be purchased, and some of the other rules are freely downloadable. But a lot of the effort, time on step 1 is to do with studying and analysing the documents, what it will mean for your organisation. The next first step, is probably unlikely to be external costs, is getting the implementation project going. Who's going to be involved in it, which parts of the organisation have to be mobilised, and getting management support for your timelines and to get sponsorship on implementing TickIT+. Okay, step 3 is training and communications. That's really about building out the internal competence, your organisational understanding of TickIT+, using some of the things I've mentioned in obstacle 2 about it seeming complex. Following the guidelines against that obstacle should enable you to get your awareness and understanding in place. Now that can involve external spend on training courses and if you're doing formal training. And that is really down to the level of understanding you need to build in your organisation, how many of your internal practitioners you want to get trained, whether you're a large organisation or not. There's 2 important steps which are to do with things you have to produce for TickIT+. That's the assessment strategy, which is a document explaining your overall approach, and the process reference model. Actually, that's a whole obstacle in its own right, and I'll mention that in a while. So those 5 steps are all about on the way to getting TickIT+ implemented. And as you can see, actually, the step at the end is what people think about, well, what are the costs, which is, and it's really just a full stop at the end of your implementation plan. Transitioning to TickIT+ is done in 2 steps, the document review and the assessment readiness review, which is needed, and then the transition assessment itself. Let me cover 2 aspects of this plan, which bear on the issue of cost. First of them is the assessment strategy. You have to produce an assessment strategy document. Actually, organisations have been a bit outflanked by this, but if you've understood the scheme and document your assessment strategy, you'll have a far better idea about what you've got to achieve and be able to think about what the likely investment is needed to get TickIT+ implemented. Because the assessment strategy, it collects the key information about TickIT+ in your organisation, such as scoping, how big you are, what processes you're using, which scope profiles that are relevant. As I've mentioned, they have to be tied to what your organisational activities are, and the 2 ones that I've already mentioned are normally the ones that organisations would start with. Why is it important? Well, we can only go so far with the information that we're given by organisations. Assessment strategy actually gives us the detail, so DNV Business Assurance can provide an accurate quote. And that's because the number of processes that are acting or that are present in an organisation will influence the duration of a TickIT+ assessment. There's a wide range of factors we have to take into account. The assessment strategy is a core document that gives us the data we need. As a starter for 10, and this is in the core scheme rules, here are the bullet points of the contents of an assessment strategy. It's not all exclusive, but it's not all inclusive. There may be other things you want to put in, but these are the essentials that it has to cover. And a couple of the key points in there is how many people are covered by the scope. As you can see, third from the bottom, the number of defined processes. That's quite important because all companies' process sets can be quite complex in some cases, and the number of processes that need to be assessed, let's call defined processes, and these can be separate to a different number to those in the TickIT+ base process library. That drives what's needed for assessment. An explanation of anything peculiar about implementation, that's also quite important because, for example, if you've got a particular process, like you've got a distributed virtual test team that's in a number of different sites, that might be a key bit of information to include in the assessment strategy, so it can be taken into account when we're doing the assessment of that particular process. Okay, assessment strategy document is a key driver to understand what the actual costs will be. Let's have a little look at just what's involved in a TickIT Plus transition. And it's two-stage, and that's quite important. Rather than just a single visit, there is an extra element in that we do need to do a review of your TickIT Plus documentation and your readiness to take on the TickIT Plus certification. Although they're two separate reviews, they can normally be combined. So things like the reviewing the documentation and the PRM, the process reference model, together with your readiness for assessment built on an assessment plan or agenda for the assessment, can normally be done together and worked out together. It does need the input at the left-hand end. You do need to create those two core documents, so they need to be present and available for this stage 1 combined document and readiness visit. And then the on-site assessment, stage 2, is the classic on-site visit by the assessor. Now, the Blue Cross. TickIT Plus captures the results of an assessment in something called a PAM, Process Assessment Model, and as I mentioned, there's an intercept process for TickIT clients, which makes it more easy to move across to TickIT Plus. You don't need to create a PAM for a transition assessment if you're TickIT already. So the stage 2 on-site assessment replaces your normal periodic. The document review, assessment readiness review, is done 4 to 8 weeks before then, to just make sure you're ready, and off you go. The on-site assessment for a transition for TickIT clients feels very much like a 9001 audit, but it's using the TickIT Plus process model to drive the interviews. We don't need to characterize the processes formally or create a process assessment model. This is a one-time availability within the sunset period for TickIT clients to move over to TickIT Plus more easily. And it's only available as a replacement for surveillance visits. And that's my strong recommendation to TickIT clients, is if you want to control the costs, look at transitioning at one of your surveillance visits in the next 15 months. Okay, so where are we? The final obstacle I wanted to cover, and that is creating the PRM. But what's a PRM? Well, a process reference model. And we've had some feedback of organisations saying, oh, this looks like a lot like hard work. We've got to create this big rolling document. We've got too many processes. It would take far too long to create a process reference model. Stop and think, because this obstacle is really about how well do you understand your own processes. What actually have you got as operational processes in your organisation that bear on your ICT activities? And I do understand that demonstrating exactly how you meet compliance standard can seem intimidating, because reality is very complex and messy. Organisations' processes have a tendency to grow. Trying to map all of those to a formal standard can seem a bit of a tall order. The reality is, actually, from my experience of doing quality, a lot of quality management audits, is most organisations have already done this. They already have a mapping table in some form as part of their quality documentation, where they've tried to map their processes to the ISO 9001 standard. Leverage that. If you've got a mapping table like that, you can use the base process library, which then gives the onward mapping from ISO 9001 to TickIT Plus processes. So you can actually just follow the links to find out how you're meeting each of the base process requirements. But even if you haven't got a mapping table, there's benefits in benchmarking your business processes against the TickIT Plus process model. It normally outweighs the effort that you've put in. For this reason, gaps, missing or incomplete processes. So, just to jump to the second bullet, these are the implementation steps. You have to construct a table where you show how your processes relate to the individual elements of the BPL processes that are relevant for your scope profile. And if there are any gaps, and that's typically where you've got a process that's missing, or perhaps a process that's incomplete, you need to fill them. And that's not just a drag as in, oh, damn, we've got something that we've got to do for the TickIT Plus process. It's an expectation for a process that it is somehow, it's deficient if it's not addressing that requirement in the base process library. What we've found, well, I have actually found, certainly at the organisational level, that it's the TickIT Plus processes have given a certain edge to some of the functions that are normally can be fairly light, as we call them in, say, 9001 terms. Some of the extra rigour that the BPL processes bring in for some of the supporting and organisational elements can be very, very useful inputs to an organisation's review of their processes. There's a formal definition of what a process reference model is. I just need to keep saying it is no more than a mapping. It really just shows how your processes relate to the TickIT Plus standard. You've got to have one. You cannot avoid it. Why? Because it's a reference point for the assessment itself. We use the process library as the lens for TickIT Plus assessment, but we have to use your own processes to focus that lens onto your activities, your documents and records. Now, a key thing is there doesn't have to be a one-to-one mapping. Okay? Those of you who thought, oh my goodness, there's 40 TickIT Plus processes, we're going to have to create 40 processes. I'm a small organisation, we've only got 10. Oh no, we've got... Right, don't worry, because it doesn't imply, the base process library does not imply that you have to have an individual process. Some small organisations can wrap up a number of TickIT Plus processes into one approach if you're quite small. Another way to manage the generation of the PRM is something I mentioned earlier, scope profiles. What this is showing on the left is the full set of TickIT Plus processes, all 40 of them. What we have in the middle is a typical organisation. It says, well, I'm focused on systems and software development and support, so actually I only need to formally map 22 of those processes. Makes it far more straightforward because the chunks that you have to bite off are that much smaller. So that's quite important. You only need to map the processes that are required by your scope profile. For those eagle-eyed of you who think, well, what about the two at the bottom of that column? Actually, they're not required at foundation level. Those two processes are specifically there for the higher grades of TickIT Plus. So although if you're going for the higher grades, you will need to wrap in those two lower processes to do with performance management and process improvement at the quantitative level. They're not required at foundation level. So 22 processes only, rather than the full 40. Let's have a look at this idea of complexity. The base process is generic. And here we have the one carried forward from earlier, the risk management generic process. And it shows activities or base practices for tagged BP, BP1, 2, and so on to BP6. There are the activities that are needed to show that risk management is working. And then some indication of the typical inputs and outputs from those activities. These are the work products which an organisation would need to be using make that process work. I want to focus on the output work products. There's 7 of them when I counted them last, 7 individual output work products in a generic process. Well, let's have a look at a typical organizational process reference model. And in the red box, you can see the generic work products, the organizational work products are mapped across to the generic work products. So I've included them both for reference. So the generic risk management process expects to see 7 output work products. Well, this PRM mapping is focused on the outputs. It's a small organisation, and they've got at the heart of their risk management approach is something called the Risks and Preventive Actions Register. And actually, when the quality manager did the mapping, he realised that the register addresses most of the requirements of the output work products. So we didn't have to go away and create a separate risk management plan, looking at BP2. You didn't have to go away and create a whole separate document of risk mitigation actions, looking at BP3, or BP5 risk reports. Actually, the Risks and Preventive Action Register, when you look at what's in there, covers most of the output work products. So this organisation, the well-known Acme company, actually only needed 4 output work products for risk management. So this is a way of saying you don't have to slavishly follow the BPL one for one. You look at what you've got, take a considered view about whether it addresses the requirement in the base practice and the description of the output work product, and tag it accordingly. I also always find that notes and comments to just give a little bit of an explanation are absolutely invaluable rather than just the simple cross-referencing, which is the formal requirement. So that's something to think about. There's no formal definition about how a PRN should look and what should be in it exactly in terms of structure. It's down to yourself. So you've got a lot of flexibility. You've got to make sure that the mappings are clear and appropriate for your organisation. Okay? So, where does that leave us? In terms of conclusions, well, the TickIT Plus scheme is developing. It's growing over the past 18 months since we've launched. We've had a number of organisations have achieved TickIT Plus certification. I think hopefully from what you've seen in my presentation, it does provide significant step forward over the simple 9001 TickIT certification. I've given you some mechanisms to help you hurdle the obstacles, or circumvent them, or dig underneath them. Use your own metaphor. But what I would say, especially for TickIT organisations, the need for action is now. The deadline, it is the end of November 2014, but when you're talking about a visit every 6 months or even annually, there's limited opportunities to make the transition. So don't get left behind, start to look at your implementation project as soon as you're able, and hopefully you'll cross the finishing line ahead of your competitors.
Thank you, Paul. I think we are doing pretty well on time. So everyone, I noticed that some questions have come in already. As we have a few extra minutes, please make sure to keep sending your questions by entering them in the field and the questions panel of the GoToWebinar tab. So, Paul, let's get started with the first one. Okay. The first one that's come through is, you already answered one about the variant of ISO 27001. Okay.
I'll cover some more on that actually, right, Naveen, because the question was is noting that ISO 27001 is being released in an imminent update of the process model. Yep, so thank you for the delegate for submitting that. Actually,
okay, a lot are coming in.
Actually, the release was mapped against the ISO 27001 2005 standard. That's because of the lead times. That's because of the lead times for doing these mappings and upgrades. So the uncertainty about the release schedule for 27001, where we started the initial design to do the mapping, meant it would look fairly comfortable against the 2005 standard. It's just unfortunate that the working group for 27001 has made very good progress, and they do expect to release an update ISO 27001 quite short, well, before the end of the year. However, nils desperandum, there's always a transition period for these new standards. We have noted this, and we are working on an initial mapping of the TickIT Plus processes to the new 10-clause structure of these management system standards, such as the new release of 27001. So we expect to run the two mappings alongside one another for the overall transition period for 27001. But what I would say is that the transition period is normally quite extensive. So you're not going to see ISO 27001, the 2005 version, disappear. There'll be a lot of organisations having to cope with the updates to 27001 and build in an changeover, during which both certifications will be valid. To be more of interest to organisations who haven't even started to implement information security, they shouldn't really, they should be, if they do consider that, they need to be looking or perhaps waiting for the new release. So we will actually be mapping against the update of 27001, but when that is officially released. We've done some preparatory work, and we will be able to cover both versions of the standard. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So let's look at another one. Well, this is a quick one we can answer. That Paul did mention that the previous webinar, the introduction to the essentials, is available on the website. Well, everyone, we will circulate an email right after the webinar with a link to a direct link to the website, so you'll be able to download quite easily. Then another one, Paul. Would you like to take this one? Organizations who have completed the PRM with the current BPL, how much rework is expected to be done because of the inclusion of 27001?
Yes, indeed. That is always a concern, is that the BPL has been released a couple of times since the original version. I think that comes with the territory because it was self-consciously an incremental release to get the scheme going. Now, there's two mechanisms that enable organisations to manage this change. One of which is that there's some preferential rates or arrangements that if there is an incremental release of the BPL, you can get that either for a nominal fee or free of charge. I can't remember the exact details. You'll have to contact your provider if you've already purchased the BPL. So you should be able to get the updated BPL fairly straightforwardly. Now the change list will show you which processes have altered and how they've altered. So you should be able to look at the diff between the two versions. Rework, because of the inclusion of 27001, well, it depends what you want to do. If you're not adopting 27001 as formal certification, then there'll be no rework, because there should be very little change, if any, to the processes that are impacted for the current scope profiles. The rework would only come in if you say, right, we want to adopt formal 27001 certification as well as the core 9001. That will mean that you will need to map in the scope profile information security management. Let me just check the name of that. And that's a specific scope profile, information management and security, the other way around, which pulls in the processes that are relevant to managing and security and protecting data. So that would be the rework. You'd have to do some mapping of how your processes meet the requirements in the generic BPL processes that are relevant to that scope profile. And there'll be a number of different processes that are brought in extra to the normal systems and software development scope profile. Things like disposal of equipment, information management process, there's a number of them in there. Okay, so hopefully that covers what is needed in terms of rework.
Okay, so let's look at another one. I think you may have covered parts of this. Is it possible to know what all base processes will undergo changes in September 2013 in that release of the BPL?
Okay, yes. The actual list of changes, each of the BPL releases comes with a change note, and that will indicate which processes have altered and what the changes will be. So that will give a direction to an organisation as to where they need to focus on any alterations to their process reference model. Now, we do understand that that can be a drag if you've done the mapping, but helping to alleviate the impact by making clear where the changes are and what they are, so an organisation only needs to focus on the delta rather than go through the entire process model. So that will be managed by the publication of the scheme documentation, which I expect to be later on in September.
Okay, all very, very valid questions. So I hope, everyone, please do continue sending questions because this is the time to ask Paul. Of course, he is available afterwards as well. Then, there's another one. As of now, what is the date until which TickIT can still be issued?
Yes, yes, thanks for the question on that. And this is really of interest to existing TickIT organisations. Now, there is an expectation that that you should really be thinking of transitioning well before the end of November deadline. Okay? Now, what this means is that at that date the certificate will become invalid. So what we're giving as a rule of thumb is that you should be looking to have transitioned by the end of September 2014, i.e. your audit, your assessment should be completed by then. Why a 2-month gap? Well, that's because there's certain certification formalities that have to be completed once an assessment is finished. And amongst them could be addressing any major non-conformities that have been found. And if you leave the assessment till too late, too close to the end of the deadline, you'll find that the clock runs out before you've managed to address the gaps and got the follow-up assessment completed to show that you comply with TickIT Plus. So there's another rule of thumb. It's not an official deadline, but it's something we're recommending to our clients. End of September 2014 should be the last date at which your TickIT Plus assessment should have been completed. Okay? Now let's work further back. That's fine for existing TickIT organisations. And that's organisations who are what we call the surveillance cycle. Now, if you're new to all of this and are thinking of taking an IT certification up, actually you got two options. You could go straight in with TickIT Plus, and that would not be a transition, that would be a full TickIT Plus initial assessment. Another option, which comes with pros and cons, is, especially if you've started a 9001 implementation, is go for the TickIT certification, initial TickIT certification, and then look to transition to TickIT Plus at your next surveillance visit. Now, there's some risks with that because there's limited time to do that, so your project will probably have to be already in flight. But we are not barring organisations from getting initial certification to TickIT if they've already started. but there will be a cut-off point, which we haven't defined yet, in the middle of next year, where we'll be not accepting any more applications for TickIT certification. Okay? Each case will look as it comes along because every organisation is different. My main interest is to encourage organisations to take up TickIT Plus and reap the benefits of the scheme as soon as they're able. Okay, hopefully that covers that. What other questions have we got, Naveen?
Well, there's another one here, Paul, that says, at foundation level, is the document review sufficient, or should projects go through the process of facing an audit like any other CMMI or ISO audits?
Let me see if I understand that. The question is built around whether a documentation review is sufficient for foundation level, or should projects face an audit like the CMMI model, like a CMMI assessment. Well, let me interpret that in two ways. Sorry if I don't fully, if I have got the slightly wrong gist. But for foundation level, you definitely need an assessment. You need both. You need the document review to make sure that your organisation or process reference model is in place, and you need the on-site assessment to confirm the implementation of the TickIT Plus processes is operating. So that's the external view. Now, if you mean internally, should you be able to just take the document review internally and just say, yeah, we're ready? That is really down to yourselves. If you're a CMMI literate organisation and you feel you've got very good coherent mapping between your processes and the TickIT Plus process model, you might be in good shape. What I would suggest, however, is you do some spot checks, some internal assessments, perhaps using one or two projects, or perhaps identifying a core critical process and assessing a number of projects against that process, where you actually assess them against the TickIT Plus process model. You might find that that throws up some gaps or some findings which you would prefer to get fixed before the formal external assessment. So you do have some flexibility there, and it really depends on how mature your processes are. Very good. I can see the questions coming in thick and fast now. Everyone's in question mode. And what's the final question we've got here?
Can we aim for information security scope profile assessment in March, April 2014? So ISO 27001 assessment.
Well, I don't see why not. The signs are, and this has to be confirmed by the scheme rules, is once we release the next release of the process library and the core scheme rules to formally identify ISO 27001 as being available, and the certification body is accredited to issue ISO 27001 certificates, like DNV business assurances, there's no reason why we can't then hit the ground running. So, my only concern is looking at some of the delays in our publication schedule for TickIT Plus documentation. It should be out in September. That would give plenty of time for March and April horizon to say, yeah, we want to be the first TickIT Plus ISO 27001 organisation. There's a caveat. You also need 9001 in place. That comes as said and as part of the baseline for TickIT Plus. So there is no current arrangements to just get TickIT Plus ISO 27001 only. I hope that was clear in what I said earlier, but it is an expectation that organisations will be delivering services, and they'll strap security protection around those services and products.
Okay, I think we have time for about 2 more questions, Paul. So, regarding the PRM, what level of detail should I map into the PRM? For example, should I go down into individual work instruction level?
Oh, I see. Yeah, this is a question around managing the complexity of that reference model. Difficult to say. Initially, no. I think if you're going down into, oh yes, this requirement is met by this sentence or this set of sentences in a detailed work instruction, you will be wandering into what the requirements boys called analysis paralysis. Don't get too bogged down into the details of your individual standards and work instructions. Try and look at your overall processes and the key procedures supporting them. And the main thing to do in the PRM is look at the base practice requirement, because that will give you a guide as to what's got to be covered. My counsel is to try and at least indicate where in your process or procedure that requirement is covered. In some instances, you can just insert the reference to, oh, the TickIT Plus work product is you must have a procedure for managing risk. Fine, just reference the procedure. But the base practice might also say, look, you've got to show what your risk thresholds, how they're being managed, and what their timescales are. And you think, that is defined in in a specific section within a procedure. So try and indicate where in a larger process or procedure you're tackling the TickIT Plus requirement. So that's the level of detail, so it's clear where you need to go to confirm what needs to be done to meet the TickIT Plus requirement. Okay? What I suggest there is grab one or two of the TickIT Plus processes, have a go at mapping a couple of them, and that will quickly give you a feel for whether you're going to get bogged down in detail, or whether you're staying too high, or whether you've hit about the right level of detail.
Okay, I think we're almost done, but Paul, if you could kindly answer this one very quickly. Which document should we refer to if we want to understand the base process expectations clearly?
Okay, yes, that's fairly straightforward. It's the base process guidance document. It's a fairly extensive description of the base processes and the requirements in them, and what it might mean to an organisation in terms of the raw requirements, and typical examples are in there. So I'd definitely point you towards the guidance document for the base processes for that. And again, that's available through the TickIT Plus website.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you everyone for your questions. I will quickly wrap up. Just a reminder that I know that there are some more questions as well, so please email Paul as soon as you can, really. The email is paul.breslin@dnv.com. So, just some closing comments. Two-day foundation training on the 18th and 19th of September in Cheshire. Should you like to attend. More details are available on Develop Capability Limited. So the website is developcapability.co.uk. There's also a one-day foundation workshop on the 16th of October in London, most likely on DNV premises, but again, this is slightly dependent on numbers. Once again, you can register on developcapability.co.uk. As far as TickIT Plus documents go, you can qualify for a discount on startup documents when you order through Develop Capability once you've registered for the two-day course. So please go online and inquire. As far as quotes are concerned, to obtain a quote for TickIT Plus certification, please email certificationuk@dnv.com. We will need some basic info like company name, the number of sites you're looking at, staff numbers, current certification, the scope profile, as well as the number of defined processes. Again, these slides will be available to you shortly, so you can have a think and run through all the requirements. Just a reminder again of the emails. There's Paul's email, paul.breslin@dnv.com, and for a quote, it's certificationuk@dnv.com. So thank you so much once again, and apologies that we haven't been able to answer all your questions, though we did answer most. So once again, please be in touch, and until the next webinar, we are curious to know your feedback, and also if you have any requests for future webinars, please be in touch. And take care. Have a good day, everyone.